Good evening to everyone joining in India and good morning to everyone joining in the US. I'm very excited to welcome our Zoom audience to the final webinar in this series. Since January, we've been hosting the Indian Data Seminar Series in collaboration with CASI, the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Philadelphia, is a unique research institution that aims to nurture a new generation of young scholars of contemporary India. We've had a really great time through the year, hearing from a range of people working on specific data sets, ranging from people working in government around data on rural facilities, people working on education, health, and the question and answer sessions at the end have been really enriching. Additionally, the fact that we put the slides and the links to the talk up on the website as this talk as well will go up afterwards means that the conversation continues far beyond this 1 hour alone. So my thanks to Tariq Tachil, CASI's wonderful director, and everyone at CASI for hosting us through this year. I'll do a quick round of thank yous at the end as well. I'm going to keep this introduction short, but in many ways, it's only fitting that Paul is our last speaker and that we're talking about Shrug today, because if you look at all of the data sets that we've talked about through the year, one sort of fundamental question is how do you make them talk to each other? So when people presented on health, there were immediately questions about, is there a way to link this with geographic data and try and say something about access to health or targeting schemes? And in some ways, what not just Shrug has done, but I think Sam and Paul and their colleagues' work in other institutions, including their work with the Indian government, has really been focused on taking data sets that exist and try to do more with them by helping them speak to each other. So just a quick introduction of Paul before I pass this on to him. Paul Novosad is an associate professor of economics at Dartmouth College. His research examines why poor countries have remained poor for so long and what interventions can help improve the lives of people in developing countries. He is founder of Development Data Lab and a creator of the Shrug dataset. Thanks very much, Paul. We're thrilled to have you today, and over to you.
Great, thanks for the kind introduction, Rukmini. I'll just get my presentation sharing here. So thanks to everyone for coming today. Let me make this full screen. Hide my Zoom controls. Okay, someone make a sign if you can't see my slides, but hopefully this works. Yeah, great to have this opportunity to talk to you guys about what we're doing with Shrug, and I'm a big fan of CASI and the group of scholars assembled there. It's just one of the fantastic centers of really thoughtful research on India. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about details of Shrug, how we built it, how we how to use it, what's in there. But I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about just kind of the idea of open science and what we're trying to do with Shrug is really promote norms of open science and change how social scientists work with each other. And the background is that there's just tremendous unrealized scope for better data collaboration in the social sciences. Current norms are just leaving a lot of low-hanging fruit on the table in terms of improving our ability to just use social science data to learn about the world. And so the Shrug is our copyleft data setting platform for research on India. I think many people in the room have already heard of it or used it. You might be less aware of how we're trying to use this data set to extend the open source software model to social science research. So the way open science should work in theory in the social sciences, as everyone here knows, it takes a lot of time to build a new data set. Maybe you have healthcare claims data from a state government that you've been working with, and it can take years to turn that data into something that's analyzable. In principle, once you've done those years of work, you can then share and post your data. Then nobody else has to redo all that work you did of cleaning identifier locations and understanding which variables make sense and which ones don't. Openly sharing the data allows other people to replicate your work, which is really valuable for building credibility. And then other researchers can reuse your data for their own original analyses. And there's so many ideas out there in the world that there's pretty low risk of other people taking your data and scooping you on the things that you're doing, and ultimately like society benefits if more people are working with these data sets. In practice, there are major technical and institutional barriers to this open science world. The technical barrier is just that it's hard to create, even if you want to create open data, just posting your code and data doesn't really do it. If you've ever tried to download someone else's code repository, it's really, really hard to get other people's code to work. It's hard to get other people's data to work. They chose their own identifiers, their own variable names. It's not really well documented. The kind of internal work we do to produce a research paper, if you just make all that open source, it's kind of not, it doesn't really get you there, because there's so much internal hidden knowledge. There's kind of latent knowledge in what things mean. There are also major institutional barriers to data sharing, which is that for many researchers feel that keeping data private just benefits is like what their incentives suggest to them to do. It takes less work. As I said, it takes a bunch of work to share data. It takes less work to just keep everything private. It lowers the risk of failed replications. Maybe I don't want people replicating my papers because it looks kind of embarrassing if one of my papers doesn't replicate. That's, not how scientists are supposed to think, but I think we all know that there are many scientists who, do feel that way. And it allows monopoly control of data for future projects. If I don't share my data, nobody else can scoop me on what I'm working on. And, we want to pretend that scientists are all, fully pro-social and aren't affected by these individual incentives. But I think when you work in this space and you see, you spend some time in here, you realize that these incentives actually matter quite a bit. And so the result is that there is less public data than there should be, and the public data that is created is often of limited use to future resources. There are journal policies focused on replication. When you publish a paper in Econ now, you need to publish a replication repository. This is not really solving the usability problem, because I can publish my code without linkable identifiers to other things in the world, so other people can't use it for their project. I can publish like the minimal working version of my code, which meets the replication, but makes sure that nobody else can use this data for a different project. So the current state of the world is still that most people's data work is only benefiting them. And you have like dozens and dozens of researchers doing the same cleaning operations on the NSS, trying to be like, how do I link these NSS district codes to the population census? And like, there must be like hundreds and hundreds of people who've struggled through the same problem. And there's just no benefit to the world of everybody doing this over and over. This is even more, the returns to open work are even more important when you talk about administrative data. And by administrative data, I loosely mean government generated data that covers the universe of people represented by a government. So in India, we're talking about data where we have individual data on every single person in the country. When you have sample survey like the NSS, there's not as much, am I getting ahead of myself here? Maybe, but I'll say it now anyway. When you work with sample data, there's not as much return to other researchers for making your data linkable, right? If I run a survey on microfinance in, 200 neighborhoods in Hyderabad, and you run a survey on water access in 5,000 villages in UP, the fact that our data don't speak to each other, use different identifiers, doesn't matter at all, because what are you going to do? What are you going to do by linking these two data sets? On the other hand, if you're working with the Ministry of Water Resources and you have data on, every water access in every village in the country, and I'm working with RBI and I have village banks in every village in the country, then all of a sudden, if our data can speak to each other, the returns are really high. So I think the fact that people haven't been thinking about how to make data cleanly linkable is a little bit because we're still thinking in this sample survey world and not in the new administrative world. So the research value of working with administrative data really scales with the number of data sets that you have, right? Every new administrative data that enters the public domain is like multiplicatively useful, because every other administrative data source that someone's working with can work with that. And so researchers working in silos, you can't really mobilize administrative data effectively, because it takes years to build up your individual database. So if you build up your incredible health insurance database covering, 5 major states in India, that's great, but you're not going to spend 5 more years to get the banking data set, and then 5 more years to get, you know, one of these other cross-domain data sets. And so when we have a system where people can safely share data, obviously respecting personally identified information and so on, it really massively expands the value of what you can do with administrative data. So here's the idea that is the foundation of the Shrug. The Shrug is a data backbone. It's a the goal is to create a backbone that kind of has every possible identifier in India that you could link on. 1991 population census villages, 2001 census blocks, 2013 economic census identifiers, local government directory identifiers, and so on. We want to create a data backbone that easily links to all these things. This means that no matter what unit of aggregation you're working on, you can easily link to this backbone. And then we have an open architecture associated with that, a bunch of institutional details we have that we're trying to shift norms and shift incentives so that people who use this data platform also make their data publicly available. And so we're doing 3 things. One, we have a citation system where, and data citation is increasingly the norm. If people who contribute data to the Shrug, when you download data from the Shrug, we keep your citation associated with the data that you uploaded to the Shrug. So if people connect to the Shrug and use data which an individual has contributed, you get cited. And that's citations are like the currency of academia. So we're trying to raise the incentives to actually sharing data. And it's actually a good way for your work to be known about. If your paper is the one that makes, you know, RBI village level data available to the world, then more people are going to learn about your paper. We use copyleft licensing in the licensing agreement for the Shrug. This is not something that we're going to go take you to court over. It's more of a nudge, but the copyleft idea comes from open source software, and it's that open source software is usable by anyone. Anyone can incorporate open software into their projects. But if you incorporate open source software into your project, you need to make your project open source as well. So what we ask Shrug users to do is if you integrate Shrug into the project, then the new data that you're bringing in, you should be making a reasonable effort to make it public early. And then we're doing a bunch of work to make it easy for you to make that data public. We have a contribution checklist, a bunch of suggestions. And if you have a really major data set, we will even work with you to make your data speak better to our backbone. We'll if it's a major data set, we'll incorporate it into the next round of the Shrug. So this is Dolly's rendition of one of our data scientists at work at the Shrug. So the Shrug stands for the Socioeconomic High Resolution Rural Urban Geographic Data Platform for India. It took us a really long time to find an acronym that worked, but you'll probably never see the long version of it again. But in case you're wondering where the name comes from, one can stretch a meaning to it, but it's really just the Shrug. So the idea of the location backbone in the Shrug, and the reason we think this is valuable is it's really hard to link locations over time in India because boundaries change, city boundaries change, village boundaries change. There are keys between the censuses, but they're incomplete, they're hard to use. And so what we've tried to do is we've tried to create a set of universal boundaries. We call these SHRIDs, Shrug identifiers. And the idea is that a SHRID is either a village or a town for which the boundaries will stay the same over all the periods that you look at it, right? Imagine that a town is, I guess, one thing that happens is that villages get incorporated into towns over time. So what we do in the Shrug, I guess here's just a visual example of it. Imagine that in 2001, this orange area is one village unit and these 2 blue areas are another village unit. And then in 2011, village boundaries have changed. This village has been incorporated into the hexagonal village, and then this triangular village has split off. We essentially create one single Shrug unit that incorporates all of these, and then you can study that in all years, in all periods. What you don't want to do is, take this 2001 census unit and look at like the average primary schooling rate in this unit, and then compare that to the 2001 census unit, the closest one you can match. You're basically comparing apples to oranges here. The idea of the Shrug is that we have a set of units which are consistent in the time series. And our time series right now covers the 91 through the 11 census, going back as far as the 1990 economic census and all the way up to relatively recent Project Antiodaia data. So you have almost a 40-year time series, and when the new census comes out, whenever this happens, we'll be continuing to incorporate that as well. So it essentially lets you do time series analysis without having to worry about the location problem. Sometimes this is easy, like if village A and B are combined into Shrid B, because in one of the census years they're combined, then it's very easy. You add up the populations, you take the weighted average of the number of households with electricity based on those populations, you add up the number of primary schools, and you can perfectly describe what's happening in this, what we call Shrid B, which is essentially another village. It gets a little bit tricky because sometimes you don't have enough information to do that. So we have legislative constituency level data in the Shrug, and you'll find villages whose boundaries crosses the border of two legislative constituencies. Sometimes this can happen if it's a large village. More often it's a map error where we're taking many of these maps from different sources and putting them together. All the maps are misaligned by 1 or 2 kilometers. So we don't know exactly where this village goes. So what we're going to do is we're going to use all the information we have available to split this village's 1,000 people across constituency E and constituency F. We're going to use it based on the area of the polygon. We might get it wrong, right? If it turns out that this village has like a really big agglomeration is like almost all in constituency E, then we're making some errors here. So this is inevitable. This becomes particularly problematic in large towns where most of the data sources don't produce data at a level that can easily be disaggregated to constituencies. So I think the city of Delhi has about, I don't get this wrong, I think it has about 27 subdistricts and about 70 legislative constituencies. And population census data does not helpfully go below the subdistrict data in a lot of cities. There are ward maps, they're not really easily available. So essentially, we have to use the same kind of imputation method so in this example, you have a town with 4 constituencies where we have no information about the constituencies except their population. And so when you open this in Shrug, the Shrug is going to tell you that every constituency has the same share of households with electricity. We're going to distribute the schools across these constituencies based on their population share. But that might be wrong, right? It might be the case that constituency H has very few schools. So this is just, I don't think there is any better way to solve this than what we've done, but this is just the type of information that's not available given the underlying data. If you are using the Shrug for a serious research project, I can just advise you to read the manual. We've put a ton of work at this website, docs.devdatalab.org, on explaining the limitations of these data, explaining how we do imputation. And we have some tips on how to, I think so for our research projects, what we would do is we would not analyze constituencies in the city at all. We would basically just say the imputation is too severe for us to, we essentially have no information about what's going on in like H versus I. So if you have like a close election in one constituency versus another, the Shrug is just not giving you information to understand whether constituency H is doing better in terms of school construction than constituency I. And then there are nuances, right? The satellite data, like the nightlights data, are perfectly valid here because we don't do imputation for that. So it's when you work with administrative data like this, it really is worth taking the time to understand the data that you're working with. And we've put a ton of effort to make this as clear as possible. Write us if you have questions, if you think the manuals are unclear. This is like a thing that we're continually trying to improve. And we have a list in here somewhere which you can find, which is kind of our set of like the 5 rules, the 5 things that we do before conducting a specific research project. You may want to do something else, right? If your job is to do a map, if you're doing a mapping application, then you may be completely fine with this imputation because the average value across these constituencies is going to be correct. So that's kind of why we leave all the data there. And then we provide information about how imputed any individual location is, so you can decide on your own thresholds of how much imputation you want to tolerate. And for most of these cases, the amount imputed is like really small. Like we have 99% confidence on characteristics of some village. So we're still doing, you can't help but do imputation when you do work with these types of data, but in most cases, the amount is really very small. So some highlights of things that are in Shrug 2 that maybe people are unaware of. The economic censuses, I think, are underused. These are surveys based on the population census of every single firm in India. We're talking about 65 million firms in 2013. You have industry codes, you have town and village codes, information about male and female employment in these, and you have a time series for 23 years, which we've mapped. The major barrier to using the economic census was figuring out how to map it to villages. So we've done that work, and it's now available across this period. It's town level data, right? This is pretty neat. You don't have to work at the level of districts. You can work at the level of 5,000 or 8,000 towns and study the entire industrial structure of these places. Project Antyodaya is some of the only post-2015 village data available. As everyone here knows, where India is quite a bit behind on understanding what's happening in villages. The last major NSS consumption survey was in 2012. Project Antyodaya it's continually updating. So any individual observation, you don't know if it was measured in 2019 or 2020 or 2021, but it has a ton of village amenities. And if you want to know what's happened in the last 10 years, it's one of your only sources of data at the village level. We've also incorporated village and town level consumption data from the SECC. These are based on a household asset list, but it's some of the only granular consumption data that you can get at the village town level. We recently added air pollution. We have data from the election commission's affidavits on politician assets. All the election winners coming from the TCPD data set is in the Shrug. And the election it actually took a lot of work to get these assembly constituency identifiers to be internally consistent and to be matchable to locations in the Shrug. So this is, if you want to match election results to economic data at the constituency level, Shrug is almost the only game in town. And again, read the documentation. They're like, it works better in rural areas than it does in cities. Small towns are probably fine. So know what you're working with, but there's a lot here. And then we recently released a set of open town and village polygons. So as far as I know, this is the best and maybe the only open source village polygon and town polygon map spanning all of India. And again, it took a lot of work to do this. There were basically a lot of different sources out there, each of which were better or worse for some parts of the country than others. And we put all these together into one big open map. So I think that's a pretty big deal. And we're working on a lot of new things. One of the things that I'm really excited about is working on a new city level data set that uses the census definitions of urban agglomerations. So Delhi appears as, one major metropolitan area, as it should, instead of as like 29 distinct towns in the census, and things like segregation, inequality, access to neighborhood services at the town level. I think this is going to be a really big deal, and it's something that we're really excited about working on. Let's see. So maybe I'll go through this a little quickly. I won't give you our research examples since I'm getting close to my 30-minute timeline, but just to give you some ideas. Most variation in socioeconomic status and policy is local. So if you're looking at district level data, which is just what Indian researchers have been forced to do because that's what's been available, you're losing about 60% of the variation in living standards by aggregating what's going on in the district. Most of the poverty variation in India, most of the almost any variable you're interested in is within district, not across districts. That's kind of the core idea of the Shrug, is we want to make these type of data available. If you're doing RCTs in India, you can plug your village list into the Shrug and immediately get 30 years of multidimensional data for balance testing, for sample selection, and so on. As I said, we have town level data in the Shrug already. We're working on improving this a lot. And we're also working on creating kind of new access points to the Shrug that make it easier for less technical people to use these data. So I'm going to skip ahead on skip some of the examples.
Paul, I'm just going to
yeah.
quickly jump in to say you can take 45 minutes, not 30, so you don't have to skip too far ahead.
Yeah, I think I want to show you the platform. So it's if you're interested in the research that we've done with the Shrug, then I would definitely visit my website and click through on some of the papers and see the things that we've been working on. What I do want to take time to do is to just pitch this idea of mobilizing the crowd. Our research team is doing our best to add new data sources to this, but we're a small number of people, and the scale of administrative data sets and satellite data sets and this kind of thing is just growing massively. We can't keep up with this, and lots of people are doing really exciting work mobilizing new data. And I think we're close to a point where we can have this new social norm of when you work with some new massive data set, one of your goals should be figuring out how to make this usable by everybody else. And we're trying to make this as easy as possible. So contributing to Shrug helps your research get found. And as I said, we're doing our best to maintain attribution for this. And so if someone downloads the Shrug and uses 3 components of the Shrug, we're asking them to cite 3 papers. And I'll show you when we download the data from the Shrug. We put a big pop-up on the screen, which are like, here's the BibTeX that you can just copy paste directly into your BibTeX file to be able to cite these papers. It's not like you have to read deep into the manual to remember to cite these things. We try to nudge people repeatedly to make sure that they're citing your work when you're downloading from Shrug. Maybe I'll skip the copy left idea. I think we initially shipped this with a copy left license, to encourage people to open source their data. Obviously, this is not something that we can realistically enforce or are interested in enforcing. But I think there really is a big shifting norm, particularly among young researchers who've adopted this idea of like data should be open, research should be open and replicable. And it's really been exciting to work with a bunch of young researchers, people who've been really excited about doing projects and getting their data into Shrug. I think this is going to be the new normal, and it's one way to get your work noticed. We've certainly gotten a lot of benefit on our work by making it public. On one hand, it's just been really awesome to see people use our data for their own projects, doing things that we would never even have thought of. And for sure, more people are citing our work as a result of the open data that we're creating. In the short run, currently research teams aren't really well rewarded for producing usable data. So we're working with people who have access to kind of data sets that would really expand the scope of what Shrug would cover. So if you think you have access, if you're working with data like this and you would like to integrate it into the Shrug, don't just feel like, oh, I really want to do this, but it's going to take 3 months of time and I just can't be bothered because I've got too many other things. Reach out to us, talk to us, and we can work with you and try to figure out how to make that happen. And as I said, we also have a detailed contribution guide. So if all you're doing is posting your data on your own website, you can take a few easy steps that make it a lot easier for other people to use your data, like standard metadata templates, as advice for organizing identifiers to make things linkable, and so on. In the future, my dream is that as these open data norms become more widely established, that project funders and donors kind of recognize that it takes investment to create open data, and this should be like a part of every project. So I think the World Bank at some point had a rule where X% of their operational budget needed to be spent on monitoring and evaluation, because there's this recognition that evaluation is a really important component of the work in order to know what's working. So I think it would be something that I dream of happening is for X% of project budgets being dedicated to creating open data resources from those projects. Currently, you have to promise to make your data open if you apply to a government grant or something, a National Science Foundation grant or an NIH grant, but it's kind of cheap talk and very, very unenforced. So incorporating this into fundraising, I think, could help a lot. So here's how we envision this working. You have a health researcher working with statewide medical claims data. That's interesting in and of itself, but you can do so much more when you link these data to the Shrug. You can study the relationship between health and air pollution, between health and economic change, health and politics, and so on. So we're starting by putting this big data backbone on that we think is going to add a ton of value to everybody working on this. When this researcher publishes her paper, she also publishes village-level aggregates describing health outcomes with Shrug identifiers. And we're not asking people to open personally identifiable data. In fact, we really don't want people to host open personally identifiable data because we're working with village and town aggregates. There's very little risk of identifiability. If you know like the distribution of medical conditions for which people are hospitalized in every town in India, like that's not identifiable to an individual level, but it could be really useful in ways that you've never thought of. Once this is done, this health module becomes integrated into the Shrug, and then anybody else working on any project gets to use aggregate data from this medical claims data for all kinds of ways in which the original health researcher didn't imagine. So this is how we want this to work. Imagine this working with, imagine scaling this process by all the researchers working with administrative data in India, and the kind of data scarcity problem could evaporate very quickly. But if everyone keeps working in silos and on their one individual project, then we don't achieve any of these returns to scale. So what are we doing next? We're hard at work on a Shrug API. This is basically a programmatic access point through which people could download individual observations or fields from the Shrug. So this will make it easier to use the Shrug on a data journalist type website. And we're also working on direct access in RSData or Python, so that if you're teaching an econometrics class, you can have a single Stata command or a single R command, which would import some Shrug module into your work. So we're very excited about that for just making this much more accessible. We're working nonstop to expand data availability and continuing to work on making it as easy as possible to contribute. So the conclusion, I think this is pretty clear that there's huge value that can be unlocked in better data collaboration in the social sciences. We're trying to take the technical barriers as close to zero as possible. I think there are still institutional barriers, but those institutional barriers, a lot of them are really norm-based. And I think that people are really energized about changing this kind of private self-interested way that social sciences have worked for a really long time. So I think if you're like on the edge between, if you're kind of on the bubble between like, should I open source my work? Should I not open source my work? I'm not sure if it's worth it. I think this is a point where every single person who goes in this direction is, pushing us toward the tipping point where it just becomes the expectation, and it's the only way to do work. So we're excited to be a part of it, and hope I can convince some of you to take part in that as well. Maybe I'll just take a couple more minutes and show you some highlights of the Shrug website and the Shrug dataset that are worth drawing attention to. So I'm going to completely lost my screen. What has happened? I'm going to try to share a browser here. Okay. Somehow Zoom has completely taken over my screen, so I can see very little, but I think you guys can see this map that I'm showing you, right? Okay, so this is a web app that we created called the Shrug Atlas, and it's essentially a Mapbox Google Maps integration with a bunch of different fields of the Shrug, and it's just a way of browsing and looking at various characteristics. And we're continuing to work on this, but just to show you a couple examples. So here's the Mission Antioquia village facilities data. So we can look at primary school locations in UP. You can see primary schools are pretty widespread. Middle school is a little less common. So this is kind of neat, right? You can map out the village for every single high school in UP according to the Antioquia data. And again, this is some of the only recent village data that's been published. We incorporated this Facebook Relative Wealth Index, which is a data source that uses daytime satellites and machine learning in order to understand, predict what's going on at the local level. Again, this is one of the only data sources that's giving you living standards information post 2011 at the village level in India. And I think it's a really neat underexplored data source. Of course, these machine learning tools to predict living standards have unknown errors that people are still learning about. You can see that this model is clearly identifying cities as places where living standards are very high. But it's probably correct. One of the neat things that you see is the official consumption data, which we have in the SECC. You often can see state boundaries in the consumption data, right? And you're like, oh, are people much better off like right on the state boundary between Gujarat versus Rajasthan? And then you look at the Facebook data, and that boundary difference disappears, right? So this is telling us something about data collection and about data collection errors. And the neat thing about these satellite-based machine learning data sources is that while they have new sources of error, they don't have any of the sources of error associated with government manipulation of statistics or enumerators making up numbers or something like that. So I think it's a really neat data source that is not being I think there's a lot of mileage to get out of exploring this. So let's see what else I can show you. Maybe I'll just download one of these data sets. Which one do I want to do? If we just take this RBI data and download it, you can see as soon as I download the data, so I'm downloading the CSV file. When I download the file, immediately I get this citation box, which says, please cite this paper by Garg and Gupta, who are the ones who contributed this to the Shrug. Like I said, we're trying to draw as much attention to contributors as possible, so you get those cites for contributing your data. And if I was to open that data file, this BibTeX file would be already embedded in that folder with the data file as well. And finally, so this is a useful site that you can go to. This is linked on the Shrug homepage. This is the variable search where you can search all of the Shrug by name. So if I just type forest here, you can see in the population village directories, we have some measures of forest land. And this didn't actually work as well as, okay, Mission Antioquia, we have availability of forest land. And surprisingly, this didn't actually pick up our VCF data, which I guess is not adequately labeled. So a bad example. Okay, so this is listed as tree cover. So if I go here and I was to do tree, then you would get these tree cover data, which is this satellite data. So this is a really useful page on the Shrug because there's just dozens of data sets in the Shrug, and being able to search variable by variable. So you want to know about information on post offices, it's going to pick up the village directory. Turns out you're getting post offices in the Mission Antioquia data as well. So this is a really useful site. If you want to explore the Shrug, you can explore. There's probably like 5,000 different variables that are being searched through here. And then I draw your attention to the contribution checklist and the contribution information. If you're interested in contributing, if you have data that you want to send to the Shrug, we're still working on this, but we basically tried to make this as clean as possible, where we give you a metadata template to fill in and just a really clear checklist on how to format your location identifiers and so on. I think some of this stuff is useful, even if you're not directly contributing to the Shrug, just for thinking about how to make your data maximally usable by the public. And there's just a ton of stuff here on this documentation site. So I'd really encourage you, if you're interested in the Shrug, to check this out and take a look at our FAQ and our construction details for like all the information that you need on, what's in here, how we built it, and what are the kind of strengths and weaknesses for economic research. So that's all I have prepared. Definitely happy to hear thoughts and questions.
Thanks so much, Paul. I've got a bunch of questions already from some of the participants. So I'm going to, one person asked me to ask it. So I'll just ask you that one first, and then I'll call on a few people to unmute and ask. So this is around citing data. And the question is, let us say someone is building socioeconomic data to build a GPI model using CMI data and other sources for one's own model, which generates new data from analysis. Then how does one do attribution in that case? I'm not sure if that came through.
What is a GPI model? There were a lot of acronyms in there, so
No, I think the idea is that if you build a model using some of the data sets from, say,
yeah.
Shrug, and then that produces analysis, how would you then
Yeah, the
attribute?
norms around data citation are, I'd say, still a little bit fluid, and there's definitely like variable adherence to those norms. When people use census data, they often don't cite the Indian census in their reference list. I don't feel super stressed about that happening because it's not like the Indian census is, is gonna like their funding is not going to be determined by the number of sites they got on Google Scholar, right? So I think it's most important when you're citing work of individual scholars who've taken the work to put this together. I mean, the site is like it's like the payment for the work, and it's not even a payment because it costs you nothing to cite it, right? So if you have a model that draws in 8 different data sources that 8 different academic teams worked on, then cite all 8 academic teams that worked on it. Like it's not citations are free, so I don't. It seems like very simple to just cite what you use. I guess what can happen is I can write a model that takes 8 data sources and produces an output, and then someone else can cite my data, and then maybe the second level sites don't pick up those 8 data sources. I think that's, I guess like I think that's just inevitable. Similarly, like not every person who uses a regression discontinuity cites the original regression discontinuity paper that whoever is the first person to write that paper, I'm sure has gotten plenty of credit for that work. Regardless, I'd say, but there's also like a unethical way to do this where you repackage the data and change virtually nothing and then put your name on it and then have people cite you. And this happens with self-citation as well, where like I cite you in, I cite your work in one of my papers, and then in all my other papers, I cite my citation of your work so that I get the extra cite instead of you. So there's not like a simple algorithm, but be decent, try to give credit where for work that was done. And I think that generally works.
I'm going to jump in with a slightly related question, which is I have seen instances where researchers get privileged access to some part of data. So we definitely saw this in the pandemic when there were seroprevalence surveys, for example. And if it was something like CMIE, which is completely private, then there would be no real question around talking to researchers about bringing it to something like Shrug. But some of these researchers then do put it on their GitHubs. Or I've seen this, there are individual researchers who have got access to parts of the SECC CAS data, so for 4 states or 5 states. So how does that thinking work to try and bring it to the public in the end? Is it one of those conversations that have to happen at the time of access where you have to be upfront with the government in this instance that ultimately it is going to become public, or how is that negotiated?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And we're working with a number of private sector firms on integrating data into Shrug. And for many of these firms, some of the individual microdata is like their competitive advantage. They don't want to share like their daily village level sales by unit of like why would you it's clear that like it's like damaging to you, or it could be damaging to you to make that public. But there's often aggregate data like which is not versions of doing this which are not at all damaging to firms. And I think that if you care about making data open, then you can figure out how to do that. So if it's something like seroprevalence data, we're very concerned about privacy of medical information, maybe not concerned enough in India based on the number of like personally identified medical information that you can just Google search for. But neighborhood level seroprevalence or district level seroprevalence data that has very little risk. So yeah, I think if your data is coming under a data use agreement that says that you're the sole person who can use that data, then you shouldn't make the data public and violate your data use agreement. I think when you're at the process of, it would be nice if when people are at the point of negotiating those agreements, or even going back to their funders and their data donors and saying like, we think there's a lot of value in making this district level data public, which doesn't violate any of the principles of the data use agreement? Can we either modify the data use agreement, or can you just give us special permission to publish this? And I feel like in most reasonable partners are sharing data because they value the output. And I think that we're not just trying to write research papers, we're also trying to create tools and data sources that let other people do research. And they shared the data with you in the first place, suggesting they have at least some agreement with this mission. And I think we can just prioritize a little more trying to get data out from this as researchers.
Yep, thanks for that. Ariel, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi. Fantastic presentation. I was wondering, what do you have, or what are you planning to have? Maybe something I can contribute regarding mortality.
We don't have any mortality data. I'm aware that there's district level mortality statistics that are out there for many years. I've never worked with these data. We assembled a bunch of data sources during the pandemic on excess mortality using various sources. Those are not in the Shrug. Those are on a different data platform, which is our COVID platform. But I'm certainly would love to hear from you on what you have. I guess most our general because the Shrug backbone is local, it's like town and village level data. We're not currently doing a lot of work to integrate new district level data sources into Shrug. I just don't think it's our comparative advantage given our capacity right now. So for something like that, I could, if you wanted to make your data maximally coherent with the Shrug, we could basically share advice on how to what kinds of identifiers would make this most usable. At this point, we'd be most interested in incorporating into the Shrug if it had a more local component to it, because that's somehow like the district level data in India. There is a lot of district level data in India. Of course, it has its own problems in matching districts over time as they change very much, and we just haven't invested enough in that kind of stuff. We've been really focused on the more local side.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. So there's two questions from Akash Solanki, who's traveling, so I'm going to ask them, Paul. The first is about your point earlier about survey data and administrative data. And Akash's question is, what behavioral changes are required to transition from the survey world to admin data world? And if you could reflect on the quality of available administrative data, such as the HMIS, which are often, Akash says, generated through exploitation of precariously engaged volunteers. And then his second question is around NDAP, which is also a question I had, which is to try and understand whether, in a way, NDAP is a sort of extension of this idea, and does it reflect government buy-in to this idea, and are we seeing it being used widely? Akash's question about, is it being used widely by policy folks in a meaningful way?
So on administrative versus survey data, yeah, I think there's definitely a mindset difference that you need to go through. Typical survey data is like the NSS will have like highly trained enumerators who will spend 3 hours with every household and have multiple questions on the same kind of thing and ways of detecting internal validity of the data set. And there are techniques that people have to identify survey fatigue, and there's just like a lot of work is put into getting high quality answers to these kinds of things. When you work with I guess there's two forms of administrative data sets. Administrative data sets like the economic census are really fast and furious. Like I think maybe I'm off by an order of magnitude, but I think something like 100,000 enumerators were hired to run the economic census with 2 to 8 weeks of training, and you have like a short form of like 12 questions for every firm, and then you move on to the next one. So the administrative data, hand-collected administrative data, has a ton of errors, but it's okay if there are like 10,000 erroneous entries because you're surveying 65 million firms. But you need to look and think about your data and ask yourself, like, do I really believe that there is a firm employing 17,000 women in this village of 700 people, and Probably not, and that's a data point that you should throw away. So administrative data is full of errors. It's also full of signal, but you need to pay attention to outliers. Pay attention. And this is probably true of any data set, right? You should kick the tires pretty heavily before you go too far with it. NDAP was a project that we advised NITI Aayog on, and it was something like the same idea of the Shrug in terms of creating a centralized platform for government programs. And there's a ton of really interesting data on government programs in NDAP, and it's all harmonized the same as Shrug is to district and sub-district level. I'd really strongly encourage people to check it out, especially people interested in research. There's a lot of stuff there that just nobody knows about. I would say it's underused. How much government buy-in is there? The Indian government is like a many-armed beast, and one can't speak of like overall buy-in or overall non-buy-in. Some aspects of the government are just incredibly oriented toward transparency and open data. Some parts of government are incredibly restrictive. So I'd say that NDAP was like an island of excellence. The extent to which NDAP survives and thrives and grows, I think, probably depends a lot on which bureaucrats stay around at NITI and what they value and their relative power in the system relative to other people. So I think it's a fantastic project. We were thrilled to work on it. There's a ton of value that's been created by that, and I think there's definitely one has doubt about whether these initiatives in government will survive or not survive. And I think this is some of the value. A lot of people have asked us, like, why are you guys doing this instead of the Indian government doing this? Shouldn't you be working more in partnership with blah blah blah? And for sure, that's a valid question. But ironically, I think we actually have more staying power in this than government does, because in 15 years we're still going to be working on building Indian data platforms. And any individual office that's doing this in India is subject to bureaucratic reassignment, shifts in political winds. And so, it's funny because governments are pretty long-lived, but I would bet on our team as being kind of more as like a more confidence place to have to be doing to be reliable in the long run for this. I mean, I hope that that's wrong. I hope that the Indian government and NDAP, continues to thrive. I think it's a great project, but anyone who's worked in government knows that like all it takes is one person to get reassigned to a new job and everything can fall apart.
Yep. Yeah. Yes, thanks for that. And I'm going to ask one question, which will be the last question. So I wanted to ask a little bit more about, I've seen the Facebook Wealth Inequality Index, and you mentioned a little bit about talking to other private firms. Now, this is something that doesn't exist in a structured way. And again, during the pandemic, we saw great use of it. So Google Mobility Trends, for example, which briefly became open to everyone and have now gone back to not being open. But, my sense has always been, again, through some of these conversations, is that there does exist significant interest in many of these firms to make data that could help with decisions, public good stuff, to make non-personally identifying, non-competitive data available here. So is Shrug able to, in a way, I've often felt that maybe what needs to happen is some sort of convening and some sort of almost like compact of private data for public good, because there does seem to be will that exists. So is the hope that Shrug is able to convene some of these firms, because I think from all of them, from Google searches, from Facebook, there is a sense that there is a lot more we could do if we got access to some of this data.
Yeah, it won't be Shrug, but we're working on this right now. We're building out partnerships with firms and government bodies, and this is this is literally the thing that we're trying to do over the next 2 years. We're working in partnership with NCAER on it, and I think this has the potential to be a really exciting project. The challenge with doing this is each partnership with each firm or government office is a unique thing, which requires a ton of investment and building relationships, and is like subject to, again, like changing bureaucrats and changing leaders. And also it's like a big technical investment, because each new data pipeline requires a bunch of technical work. The Raj Chetty Opportunity Insights team did this in the US. They began in COVID. They created an economic tracker, and this is still running 4 years later. I think that the fixed cost of creating these private sector partnerships is high, but then once you create it, the hope is that like once the firm has been doing it for a year, they're getting some good publicity. They're realizing there's actually no risk to releasing these kinds of aggregate data to them. And well, yeah, this is like the maybe the major project that we're working on in the next 2 years. So I hope to come back to this seminar again with reports on real time private sector data. It's something we're just getting started on.
That's very exciting. Well, thanks so much for this, Paul. This brings this seminar to an end, and also the CASI India Data Seminar Series for 2023. I want to thank all of the people who attended today, as well as those who've attended through the year. You'll find all of the talks and slides up on the CASI page, and I hope that can be a way to keep these conversations going. Huge thanks to everyone at CASI, especially Alan, who have made this whole seminar series happen and be so much fun. Thanks very much. And let's hope to keep these conversations going. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks for me. Thanks everyone.